Boy, with all the stuff about the the building collapsing in Miami and the mystery behind what caused that, which still waiting for more information on that, so I don't have any updates on that. I didn't want to neglect what Mark Milley said. I believe it was yesterday or the day before. I just haven't had a chance to get to it about white rage and how he wants to get to the bottom of white rage. Now, for those of you who don't know, I've never been able to stand Mark Milley. He's a typical Pentagon stooge. Essentially a bureaucrat with some stripes on his jacket, and because of that, we're supposed to respect him as some brave defender of freedom or something like that. He's a hack, just like most of the folks that work at the Pentagon. They are bureaucrats, no different than the people at the Department of Justice or the Department of Injustice, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, the ATF, all of these, the IRS, all of these agencies. There's a reason why DC and Northern Virginia all votes one way, and they all seem to have the same sort of culture and attitude. These, the folks in the bureaucracy represent the worst of the American people. And Mark Milley, is really just the pinnacle of the worst that America has to offer. He has gotten to the top of the heap. He's the king of the losers. And I don't use that word lightly. I don't just mean he's a loser in that, he does lots of things that I don't like. I mean, he's a loser in that he has never won a war. None of the generals have won a war. I guess unless you go back to, 91? The second Gulf War or first Iraq War. Was that the last real victory? And they squandered that. Of course, the politicians squandered that, so I guess you can't blame the generals necessarily for that. Bush Jr. and Clinton, and then, of course, W. put the final nail in the coffin. Whatever victory was achieved back in 1991 was thoroughly squandered. But of course, I mean, that was a gimme, that war. That was total down punching. They took on a military that had been, that was tired and was full of conscripts that had been fighting a war on behalf of the United States for a decade until the U.S. decided to just overnight turn on Saddam Hussein and try and wipe out and slaughter a lot of these poor conscripts who had been conscripted for a decade to fight a war on behalf of the United States. The U.S. military then went into Iraq, if you remember the Highway of Death, and bombed these guys as they're fleeing, trying to get out of Kuwait. None of them wanted to be there. They had families. It was truly disgusting. And so, I mean, you know what? I should look up to see if Mark Milley, what his role was back in 91. Okay, just looked it up. Apparently he was a company commander during Desert Storm, so I believe he was on the ground fighting then. You shouldn't be proud of what you did back then. Again, as I say that, I have a relative who served in Desert Storm. Of course, they didn't personally massacre any of these poor conscripts, and even if they did, I mean, I don't blame really the individual soldiers. Just in the same way that I think that the Iraqi, conscripts are in a way have a certain innocence to them. I feel the same way about the American soldier, who, while they are not conscripted anymore, the American soldiers are lied to and misled by the military-industrial complex in order to sacrifice themselves at the altar of the state and, at the altar of the military-industrial complex. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Those of you who are taking upon yourselves to quote-unquote serve your country in the U.S. military, you no longer do that these days. You're not standing up and fighting for America. The military has proven that to us over the past few decades since the end of the Cold War. Any pretense that the leaders of the Pentagon were there to use the military to send the soldiers out to fight, to protect America, that's been shattered. The troops are used as pawns to further to advance the interests of certain moneyed interests or special interests, whether they be foreign nations, domestic corporations, or just, the Pentagon bureaucracy itself, trying to justify its own existence. And that brings us to Mark Milley's words today about white rage and about how he wants to get to the bottom of it. And this purge that's been going on, led by Lloyd Austin, the new Secretary of Defense, against, white supremacy and this latest boogeyman. What is this all about? They need a new enemy. They need a new boogeyman. It used to be the Soviets. Since after World War II, the Soviets gave the military, that's what birthed the military-industrial complex. The Soviet Union was the justification that they used for everything. Every new war was, we have to stop the Soviets. Every new aircraft that they bought, if you oppose that, if you want to cut the budget, you want the Soviets to win, all of this nonsense. It was a bludgeon that they used to beat down any opposition to whatever it was they wanted. Either you do as I say, the generals would tell the president, or whoever's in power, or the American people, or people down the chain in the military. They would say, do as I say, or you want the Russians to win. And then one day, much to their surprise, something that they never imagined could happen actually happened. And it was that communism collapsed because communism doesn't work. That's why it came apart. Now, a lot of these folks, neocons in particular, since neocons were, of course, communists themselves, and that's not hyperbole. They were followers of Trotsky. That's where neoconservatism comes from. The great Soviet experiment ended in disaster, and it came apart. And with it, the Pentagon lost its raison d'etre. The Soviet Union was always there since the Pentagon itself was built. And so immediately after that, 1991, they needed to find a new boogeyman. And that is why, I think pretty clearly, they decided to trump up this fake war in Iraq against Saddam Hussein back then, who, again, up until that very moment had been a U.S. ally, fighting a proxy war on America's behalf against Iran for a decade. And so for a while, Saddam was the big boogeyman. And then it became Al-Qaeda. And then after that, it was, sort of Iran too, but they couldn't invade Iran because logistically I've gone over that in the past. A war against Iran would not go well, so they didn't do that. So they kind of conflated Sunnis and Shia and just Muslims in general became the boogeyman. And now, I guess really since al-Baghdadi died, since he was killed by the U.S., there hasn't been much of the idea of the great Saracen threat has faded away. And people aren't really scared of Muslim terrorists coming and blowing up buildings here anymore. It's been a long time since 9/11. I was like a toddler when 9/11 happened. I don't really even remember it directly. Actually, I don't think I remember it at all. I think I only remember hearing about it later. When I'm in my early 20s. So that whole, the 9/11 generation has kind of come and gone. Just like Pearl Harbor, that came and went. And so the military needs people to be afraid of something new. They need a new enemy to target. And that new enemy is the white man. It's white supremacy. It's white rage. This is what the military expects the average American to be afraid of. And they're so drunk on their own elitist woke Kool-Aid that they think that this is going to work, that this isn't an incredibly divisive thing. Because remember, back when they used to make boogeymans of the Russians, well, there are very few Russians in America. Most Americans are American and not Russian. I mean, sure, there's a small minority of Russian Americans, you could say, who maybe were not afraid of Russia, even if they didn't like the Soviet Union. But it was relatively easy, since Americans were not predisposed to like the Soviet Union, to whip up all Americans into supporting the Pentagon by saying, hey, we're against the Soviets. That's an easy thing to get by on people. Soviet Union was bad, so you tell Americans, hey, if you think the Soviet Union is bad, you need to support us at the Pentagon. Easy enough. Well, then you had the Muslim terrorist thing, and there's not that many Muslims in America. And even still, they made the government made a big effort and said, oh, we don't mean all Muslims, we only mean the terrorist ones. And so it's kind of like, for the average American, I mean, how can you be in favor of, these Muslim terrorist guys who want to go murder people in the name of God? And so that was, though I think more divisive than the Ruskies, it was still relatively easy to rally Americans around the flag to go and fight, the Mohammedans, especially after 9/11. That was sort of the creation myth of the war on terror. But now that's all over. And so they think now that they can just bring the war on terror home and target half of America and still, unite people behind the Pentagon in the same way, and that you're not just going to alienate half of all Americans against the Pentagon? Or is it, why would they do this? I mean, you're just going to create opposition to yourself. Are they clueless? Are they that, like I said earlier, drunk on their own Kool-Aid? Or is it perhaps that the Pentagon just thinks that that's the best they can do now? That they can't unite all Americans behind a single enemy. And so they have to make an enemy of what they believe to be, a substantial portion of America, about half of Americans. And that is, that's the best they can hope for, is to try and galvanize, not even the left, just, the liberals. Because, the real left is never going to like the Pentagon, I hope. But the liberals, you can get them on the Pentagon side. They were on the Pentagon side back in, at the start of the Iraq War. A lot of that stuff was bipartisan back then. The Afghan war, the war on terror. So now they just want a war on terror against the white man, against Republicans. And, the good thing is that will wake up the folks who have been historically the most, or at least since World War II. It wasn't the case before World War II, but since World War II, the American right, the conservatives, so-called, were the ones who were the most pro-military, pro-intervention, and pro-war on whatever the big bad guy was at the time. Before World War II, the conservatives were always the anti-war people, were the folks who wanted to stay out of the rest of the world, the folks who wanted a small military, the folks who wanted demobilization. That was, the old right. And now I have to say, Mark Milley and the rest of the folks, Lloyd Austin, I think are doing a good job to help reignite that fervor on the right. Because, I'll give you a good example. This J.D. Vance guy who's running for Senate in Ohio, I believe he's officially announced now. He's some big millionaire or billionaire, Wall Street guy. But I guess he's from Appalachia, and he was in the Marines. So he's, he appeals to the ordinary, to the common man, but he's also pretty smart. I'm not sure that I fully trust him. When I hear Yale and Wall Street, it's hard to trust people who went to Yale and worked on Wall Street. But, we'll see. He says good things so far. And one of them today was that he said old Mark Milley should spend less time reading about, white rage, whatever that is, and focus more on reading about how not to lose wars. And even, whether, you can argue, oh, well, he's still accepting the premise that, you could have won the wars, or that the wars should have been won, or something like that. You're getting too far in the weeds. The fact that you have a Republican candidate here criticizing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and calling him a loser, essentially, is a tremendous step forward, because it was before, on the right especially, but even on the left, it was taboo to criticize the troops, because the troops they're a monolith. You criticize any soldier or any even these guys who don't risk their lives, people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the high-ranking generals, the military brass. You're attacking the troops. Now that whole paradigm is gone. And plus, as I said before, J.D. Vance is himself a retired Marine. He was a soldier. He fought in these wars. And he's calling out the generals. And he's sort of clearing a path for people like me who haven't served in the military. And again, can you blame me after seeing what happened in the early 2000s to all those guys, how they were tricked into going to war? I don't ever want to end up like them. Who knows? If I was their age back then, after, at 9/11, if I was 18 when 9/11 happened, maybe I would have joined the military. But knowing what I know now, seeing what happened after 9/11, with Afghanistan and Iraq and all the other terror wars, both legal and illegal, around the world, the war crimes, the deaths of millions of civilians. There's no way I'm touching the U.S. military with a 10-foot pole. And I think that's the case for a lot of people, my age or even a bit older, who weren't of military age when all this went down initially, but witnessed what happened to those guys who did sign up, like J.D. Vance. Or there's a couple of good guys, a couple of good podcasters who are also veterans who sort of, during the terror wars, when participating out, they sort of had epiphanies and realized, hey, this is not what I was told I was doing. Joshua Smith, whose show is called Break the Cycle, and then Shane Hazel, can't remember the name of his thing, but they both, they have good shows, so check them out. But I mean, there's another case of how, there are veterans who clear a path for people like me to criticize the military more heavily. And that's a good thing, especially coming from the right. This is not Danny Serson, coming in and saying, doing a mea culpa and saying, hey, we Americans are all baby murderers. Danny Serson is coming from a left-wing perspective, and he's very clearly a commie when he talks. So, I mean, even though he was a major in the Army, now retired, I believe, but for a long time still active and saying what he was saying, didn't have the same effect as it would coming from somebody like J.D. Vance. Even though J.D. Vance is much more mild in his criticisms of the military, the fact that a veteran in good standing is criticizing the military at all is a very positive development for American discourse. And so I think that the latest redirection from the Pentagon, pivoting from Islamic terror to, white supremacist terror, is not going to work. And that's wonderful, because I don't think that the Pentagon has. I mean, they've tried. There was a time back in the '90s where they tried to push the white patriot, pro-constitution gun, private gun owner militia, domestic terrorist narrative. Joe Biden was a big part in that. And even back in the 90s, when we didn't really have the internet as good, like we do now, to where social media is a mass phenomenon, it didn't work back then. And so doubling down on it now is just going to polarize this country against the media, or it's going to polarize people on their opinions of the Pentagon. The military, along with, I guess, the Supreme Court, was one of the last institutions in America which had overwhelming respect from the American people. And in order for the institutions, which again, the institutions are fundamentally rotten in this country, they can't be saved. They must be torn down and replaced, with something that fills their essential functions, but gets rid of all of this rot. In order for that to happen, people need to completely lose faith in them, and the system needs to break down. And so I applaud Mark Milley. I hope he comes out and says more things like this. I hope that Lloyd Austin comes out and essentially says, hey, if you voted for Trump, you're not welcome in the U.S. military. You should resign now. I don't know what the military equivalent is of turning in your badge, but whatever that is, turn in your sidearm, turn in your rifle. I hope he comes out and says that. Of course, you don't really have much of a choice in the military, I guess, since you do sign to do certain terms. So I guess you would have to wait until the end of whatever your contract is, and then you can leave. But I mean, seeing this, how many more, young guys from Middle America, from the South, from the mountains, who are overwhelmingly going to be right-wing in political orientation, are thinking again about whether or not they want to join the military, based on everything that they've seen this year. That's sort of a change in mentality. It has ripple effects that are going to last, quite some time. So I guess that about sums things up. With that said, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.